Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I'm the host of Reformed GGA, and frankly I had hoped to be doing another video by now on a recent gun that I purchased. However, I ran into some issues with that gun, and so my review of that gun is a little bit delayed. However, thinking about that gun and kind of the purpose of use behind that particular gun and kind of where it sits in terms of my gun collection and what I expect from it and what I don't expect from it and whatnot, actually got me thinking in terms of a historical example. And revisiting that historical example I think is a useful thing because it shows us a certain amount of I think it's still instructive, I'll put it that way. And what I'm talking about is defensive guns, and particularly kind of the original PDW, the original personal defense weapon. There are lots of guns, of course, that you could call defensive guns, but as far as relatively modern guns, either semi or full auto, some people would say that a PDW strictly has to be a select fire weapon. I would argue that the first gun that really fits the category as being a military-issued weapon that was meant in its original guise and its original definition for defensive use was not actually select fire. And what I'm talking about is the M1 Carbine. The M1 Carbine is a very unique gun in the history of guns, in that in a lot of ways, it was the first modern rifle that was designed not to be a front-line rifle. It was designed with the defensive purpose of use being its primary role. It was a gun that basically came out of research in World War I, and the needs of very particular sets of troops that were not front-line troops. All of these things, a lot of research from World War I, plus the needs of kind of dynamic supply and dynamic support that you saw gearing up for World War II and certainly in World War II, kind of changed the name of the game. Up until this point, the relatively conventional viewpoint was that most of your soldiers are going to be either issued a battle rifle of some kind. At the time, it was usually something in .30-06, or they're going to be issued a handgun with the understanding that they're not on the front lines, they don't need a battle rifle, but they do need something to defend themselves if something should come up. So we'll give those ones a pistol. And the results from World War I, when it came to the use of pistols, was pretty abysmal. It wasn't that there were never any situations in which people had the chance to use the pistols. There were a few. But, like I said, the statistics that came out of it were very abysmal. After the war, a lot of field hospital reports had been captured and consolidated and those kinds of things. And American intelligence is looking through all of these reports coming out of World War I, and they found that the handguns that they were using at the time, which of course would have been a 1911 platform handgun, but this would have been true of handguns in general, not just of American handguns, but handguns for pretty much anyone in the war, was that handguns were responsible for a very, 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 very small number of enemy casualties. Basically minuscule, basically small enough to not really even be an issue. Now, that doesn't mean that the military looked at that and said, well, evidently handguns are completely irrelevant. No, handguns still have a use in the military, especially for, say, MPs, military police, as a general deterrent. That is, the fact that somebody is armed versus unarmed makes how you have to approach that person a little bit differently. And for the military, as an occupying force or something like that, having some kind of a system of deterrence, even if you never have to use it or if it never gets used, it's still a useful thing. So it doesn't mean that they were going to say, okay, away with handguns altogether, but they just simply recognize that if you want to be effective in a battlefield situation, handguns are not generally the way to go. And the reasons for this are relatively simple. At the time, you were basically working with conscript armies, people who are under a draft. They had to serve, and a lot of them were not particularly well trained. The training that they got in basic training was about all the training that they got. And handguns are relatively difficult to get real good on, especially under stress. And of course, a battlefield situation is indeed very stressful. And then there were also some issues with technique at the time. It was very conventional to wield pistols one-handed, to hold your arm out to the side and basically sight down your arm to the sights of the gun. Not the best technique for battlefield use of a handgun. So there's lots of problems. One is that the people themselves were not very skilled. There was the techniques that were being employed that were problematic. There was just the sheer stress of it being a battlefield situation. All those combined to make handguns relatively useless for inflicting casualties upon the enemy. And even today, in a lot of surveillance footage or cell phone footage, or even badge cam footage that we get of people using handguns in World War situations, we find that their effectiveness with them, especially in terms of distance, is very limited. First off, most people in general don't wield handguns very well. Most people are relatively poorly trained. And then there's just the effective range aspect of it that goes along with poor training, goes along with stressful circumstances, your life being at stake and things like that. And most people cannot effectively hit a human-sized target past 15 yards if they're relatively untrained or under any serious kind of stress and or some combination thereof. And this was also the conclusion that was coming out of World War I. Okay, handguns have a place as being a deterrence, and they're definitely useful up close, but their usefulness diminishes real quick as distance increases, and it doesn't have to get very far. The average person put in a life or death situation with a handgun who's only had maybe minimal or perhaps no real training to speak of. I mean, in World War I, they were dealing with basically you went through basic training and that was it. Relatively untrained people in a stressful situation, you're not going to get past 15 yards with it, and that generally holds true today. A lot of people who think that they're fairly proficient with handguns, put them in a stressful, dynamic situation, and those easy shots that they used to be able to make at 25 yards and even 50 yards, they can't make anymore. And like I said, a lot of times 15 yards is about the limit. This is the kind of information that the U.S. military was looking at coming out of World War I, gearing up for World War II. And the conclusion that they came to is that we need something that will get us past that 15-yard barrier that we don't seem to be able to break with handguns. And like I said, it doesn't really matter that it was the 1911 or whatever, because a lot of other militaries were more or less coming to the same conclusion. The idea of issuing soldiers something that was more than a handgun but less than a full-size battle rifle was catching on in various ways in different places. In some respects, it would kind of catch on more after the war than during. The Americans were actually a little bit ahead of the game in some respects on this particular front. Of course, there were also submachine guns that were employed at the same time, and they're kind of less than a full-size battle rifle, but those were generally used quite offensively. They were not really seen as defensive guns. They were the kind of guns that you would go into some spot and just hose down the enemy with enough fire and win that way. They were generally seen as being offensive weapons. What the U.S. military, though, in coming up with the requirements for the M1 Carbine did is they wanted something that was strictly defensive and something that would get them past that 15-yard barrier, but would not generally encumber the soldier that had to carry this thing. So it had to be relatively light. The original requirements for it was that it had to be under 5 pounds. The M1 Carbine that eventually wound up winning, I believe it was the Winchester design. I didn't quite meet that requirement, but it got really close. It was still under 5 1/4 pounds unloaded. Yeah, so it got really close to that requirement of 5 pounds. Meant to be, relatively non-encumbering, and it met that requirement. It also was designed to fire basically an intermediate cartridge. The .30 carbine round was designed from the ground up to be a rifle cartridge. A lot of people think of the M1 carbine as a pistol caliber carbine, and that's not true. The .30 carbine round is not a pistol caliber. It was not designed for pistols. Now, afterwards, it was adapted to a couple of pistol designs, maybe a few. I think there's only a couple, but I might be wrong. But afterwards, yes, it was adapted to pistols, but it wasn't originally designed for pistols. It was designed to be used in the M1 carbine. It was designed to be used in a rifle. And so it actually was an intermediate rifle round. And the main concern that the military had at the time was this thing has to be capable at range, and so the requirement that they put on it is that it had to be effective at, it was either 300 yards or 300 meters. I think 300 yards was the original requirement. And in wartime, I'm not sure that any soldier ever used an M1 carbine all the way out to 300 yards. But nonetheless, that was the requirement that was put on it. They were saying we need something that is going to get us more range than a typical handgun is. And so they put this 300-yard requirement on it, and they put it into a carbine form because carbines, rifles, are generally easier to wield than handguns are in terms of getting effective hits at a speed, under stress, and especially as the distance starts to climb. Like I said, once you get past about 15 yards, it's very hard for the average person to be very effective with a handgun. Like I said, under stress and those kinds of things becomes very problematic, but you can take a relatively unskilled person, give them a rifle, and have them hit something at 15 yards with pretty much no problem whatsoever. And so this was the idea behind it. We want something that's a little bit stronger than your typical handgun round, but it doesn't have to be a full-size rifle cartridge. This is a defensive gun. It doesn't necessarily have to be able to punch through barriers or anything like that. It doesn't have to be, sniper rifle capable. But they did want it to have more range than they were typically getting out of the handguns, and so they made range a pretty big emphasis of the M1 carbine. Something that was kind of a spillover from the traditional battle rifle philosophy was the idea of the American marksman. How true or not it was that every American rifleman was indeed a marksman is certainly debatable, but at the time that was more or less the philosophy, and that carried over into the M1 carbine as well. If we're going to give you something that's capable of more distance, we're going to make sure it's capable of a lot more distance. And the M1 carbine wound up being remarkably successful in World War II. Now, later on, at the end of the war, going into the Korean conflict and into the Vietnam conflict, they started making select fire versions of the gun, and their track record was not so great, and they started pressing it into frontline roles that it was never intended for. And in those situations, yeah, the M1 carbine quickly lost a lot of the prestige that it gained in World War II. But in World War II, it had a great reputation. In fact, it was the most produced small arm of the American that the Americans produced in World War II, and it was also the one that was most commonly given as foreign aid to other countries and things like that. It was light, it was handy, it was very, very easy for other people to use. There's a lot of other groups out there, especially groups that happen to be along the equator, that are typically a little bit smaller in frame and stature than the average American, and they really appreciated having something that was considerably lighter and didn't have quite as much recoil as a full-size battle rifle of the time did. When you're comparing battle rifles that are chambered in, say, .30-06 to the M1 carbine that's chambered in .30 carbine, yeah, not nearly as much recoil, a lot handier, easier to use, etc., etc. Wound up becoming a very, very, very popular gun. And as long as it stayed in that defensive role, most of the people who carried it in that defensive role were very happy with it, most of the time just because the thing was so stinking light compared to a full-size battle rifle. If you say, okay, you've got to be hoofing this thing around and you're not likely to use it, which one do you want to carry around, the one that weighs 10 pounds or the one that weighs 5? Well, that's a pretty easy decision. That reason alone made it very popular. But what is more surprising, though, is that the statistics coming out of World War II as to the general conditions under which it was actually used when it was issued as a defensive weapon are really interesting. The military wanted it to have a greater effective range than the handguns did, and it certainly did that. But what is surprising about it, though, is that the maximum range that they wanted for it, the 300 yards, was pretty much never used. As far as I know, there's no recorded incident in World War II or in the Korean conflict or in the Vietnam conflict of someone using an M1 carbine out to 300 yards. That was a non-issue. In World War II, though, interestingly, they found that it was either 90 or 95% of the incidents that involved an M1 carbine, the M1 carbine was used at a distance of 50 yards or less. That was really interesting. They wanted something that was more capable than a handgun, more accurate than a handgun, easier in transitions than a handgun, didn't take as much training as handguns did, etc., etc. And they accomplished all those goals. But what was amazing is that for the defensive role of the gun, basically given to more or less, behind the front line kind of people, kind of rear echelon troops, mortar crews, truck drivers, things like that. For these kinds of people, if they encountered conflict, their basic role was to get themselves out of the line of fire. It was a defensive, and if you use the M1 carbine to do that, that's great. But it turns out that these happen to be relatively close distances as far as a battlefield is concerned. The average battle rifles at the time were used at an average distance of around 120 yards. The vast majority of the time being under 200 yards, with occasional usages out to 400 yards, but almost nobody on the battlefield went past 400 yards. That was relatively rare. When you get into that, you're talking about snipers and designated marksmen, those kinds of people. The typical soldier pretty much never went past 400 yards, and on average was usually about 120 yards, with the bulk of that being inside of 200. There's a very marked difference, though. Battle rifle being used strictly offensively, the average distance was more than double what the majority distance for the M1 carbine was. And if you talk about the majority distance for the two, the battle rifles, like I said, around 200-ish yards for the majority of the work that was done with them was under 200 yards. M1 carbine, it's only sitting at about 50 for the majority of its usage. And what that shows us in the modern age is that if you're thinking about a defensive gun, something that is more than a handgun certainly makes sense. Something that has more points of contact than a handgun makes sense. A lot of us buy handguns and carry handguns because of the simple fact that they're concealable. And as long as we live in a relatively polite society, wherein concealing the firearm is something that is relevant to being able to basically live in a relatively polite society, not cause undue friction, and also not make yourself a more of a target than you need to be, I think handguns are going to be here to stay. I don't see that changing any. But when you talk about situations where concealing a gun is no longer a priority, either because the system under which we're living is significantly different, or where you find yourself is significantly different. For example, if you're at home, you don't necessarily need to conceal your firearm. So if you're talking about having a gun to defend yourself at home, it doesn't necessarily need to be a handgun anymore. You don't have to conceal it. And that's where these kinds of statistics of defensive guns that were used in past conflicts becomes really interesting, and the ways that they get used, and also the distances at which they get used. Offensive guns, average of around 120 yards, most of it being inside of 200 yards, and very, very, very rarely being used past 400 yards. Defensive guns like the M1 carbine, almost always 50 yards or less. Like I said, 90 to 95% of the time, 50 yards or less. And what does that tell us for where we are today? Well, if you're going to get a defensive gun of your own today, what that would suggest to us is that having that third point of contact, whether it be a stock or a brace or something that only has a cheek rest, there's guns that are made like that they just have a cheek rest, they don't actually have a proper stock. Whatever that third point of contact is a very significant and real advantage. M1 carbines did actually show up as causing casualties in World War II. They were actually battlefield effective, whereas the pistols did not do a whole lot to cause casualties. Pistols in general, regardless of the military, generally didn't cause a lot of casualties just because the effective range was not all that great. The M1 carbine, though, had a greater effective range. Not that it was really used to its full potential, or at least its on paper potential. Whether that was practical or not is a different issue. But it was a lot easier to wield than a handgun. But what is amazing is that it didn't have to be overly powerful to get those kinds of numbers. The success that it had was based on the way in which it was used and the people that it was given to. As long as these are not frontline people that you're giving it to, as long as it's not being used offensively, it's used defensively to get certain people out of a bad situation, the thing worked real well. And you can look at a lot of the data on the thing, and it wasn't known for being overly reliable either. Now, a lot of times when it was used in conjunction with part of a military group. Militaries don't tend to, have people doing things off by themselves too terribly much. And so even if your gun happens to jam, there's a good chance that you're going to have someone near you whose gun will still be working just fine, and you'll be able to get by. You can have a remarkably unreliable system that, if you have enough redundancy in the system, you have enough people backing you up, momentary upsets don't really matter too much, especially if the kinds of reliability issues that you have are relatively relatively easy to clear, I should say. Simple issues of just, is it just a matter of pulling back the charging handle and dumping out the round that didn't feed properly and then going at it again? Well, that's relatively easy. You can get back in the fight pretty easy with that, so on and so forth. It's amazing how unreliable a system can be and actually still be battlefield effective. That gives me a little bit of hope for the modern age, because there's a lot of guns that are out there that people are attracted to for various reasons that sometimes are not the most reliable in the world. And I would always encourage people to get the most reliable system that you can get, but sometimes you're stuck with what you're stuck with. And as long as the system isn't too unreliable and the kinds of malfunctions that it has are relatively easy to clear, it's amazing what you can do when you have to. And the M1 carbine certainly proved that. Wasn't known for stellar reliability, but it was reliable enough. It certainly was not as powerful as a full-size battle rifle, but again, used defensively to get yourself out of a bad situation, it was effective enough. In World War II, had a tremendous track record. And so how does that carry over to us today? Well, like I said, if you're in a situation where you don't need to worry about concealment, you can of course afford to go with something a little bit larger. But if you're going to be using the gun strictly defensively, it doesn't need to be that much larger. That's what I think the M1 carbine really tells us. You don't necessarily need something that would be the equivalent of a battle rifle. If you want to go that way, that's perfectly fine. That's your choice. But what is necessary to be effective defensively isn't that much beyond a handgun. You need kind of the form factor of a rifle, some kind of a third point of contact. But once you get something with a third point of contact, whether it be a actual proper stock on a rifle or a pistol brace that might occasionally be used as a stock or at least as a cheek rest or something, once you get that third point of contact, you're going to have something that, at least as per the World War II data on the M1 carbine, is going to be good enough for the job. And there's lots of modern guns that fill into that category that really open up the possibilities. Things that under stress you could use beyond 15 yards relatively easily, but realistically, you don't really need to use them past 50 yards. And in that sense, the M1 Carbine was probably a little bit overpowered, if anything. Yes, there are stories, especially that come out of Korea and Vietnam, of it being underpowered, but that was with it being used as a frontline weapon, being used at ranges that were not really being applied to it in World War II. Like I said, in World War II, the vast majority of fighting with M1 Carbine was done at 50 yards or less. They tried to extend the range in the Korean conflict and in the Vietnam conflict, and that was a problem. And then also in those conflicts, they were using select fire versions of the guns, and the select fire versions of the guns, because the gun was relatively overpowered for its weight, it's only a 5¼ pound gun unloaded. You put that thing on full auto, an M1 Carbine round, it's not nearly as powerful as say 30-06, but it still is pretty punchy. It has a 110 grain projectile, which will give you a decent amount of recoil, and it's also a drop stock design, which means that thing is going to have a tendency to rise, and for the average person it is not a very controllable firearm at all. So a lot of the stories about it not being overly effective and not having enough penetrative power, enough stopping power, quote unquote, a lot of those come from simply situations where people were missing. They'll say, yeah, I fired the gun at the person who was charging me, but how many of my shots actually connected? Especially when you're using it on select fire, or if you got startled and you just started randomly blasting away, even in semi-auto, if you're not actually really taking the time to carefully aim. That's usually cases of misses, not cases of ineffective rounds. So if anything, the M1 Carbine was a little overpowered. Oh yeah, we want this thing to be accurate out to 300 yards. Nobody in any of the conflicts in which it saw action ever took it to 300 yards. That was ridiculous. That wound up being totally non-applicable. And where it shined was 50 yards or less. And so in terms of defensive guns for us, if you want to get something that would be the equivalent of a modern battle rifle, that's fine. If you feel comfortable with a 12-gauge shotgun and you're trained to use it under stress, which, by the way, can be a little bit more difficult than you might think with a shotgun. There are a lot of people who, under stress, even relatively simple stress of putting them on a shot timer, saying, okay, get 3 shots on targets in 3 seconds, and, beep. Just that stress of having the shot timer introduced in some kind of course of fire will make people short stroke pump action shotguns pretty easily. So don't get too carried away with that. But if that's what you want to go with, and you're trained on that, and you're used to the stress with that, that's fine. But the M1 Carbine tells us that if you're going to use a gun in a strictly defensive role, yes, having something more than a handgun is good, but it doesn't really need to be that much more. And this takes us into the realm of modern guns, like pistol caliber carbines, a lot of the pistol caliber guns that have braces on them now. Most of those, as long as they're decently reliable and you're, have some kind of training on them, most of the evidence that we have based on the M1 Carbine would seem to indicate that most of those would be pretty adequate to the situation. And most of the people that I know, when they talk about their defensive guns for home use, there are some of them that insist on, full-size, full-powered guns, whether they be shotguns or rifles. Something in an intermediate rifle caliber, say like maybe the 5.56 or 7.62 by 39 guns. I'm not saying anything against those; they're all perfectly adequate, or more. But the evidence of the M1 Carbine would suggest that you could get away with something considerably smaller if you had to. I'm not saying that it's necessarily ideal, but it's amazing what you can do with just having something with a third point of contact that can extend your range out a little bit, and if you're using it under the guise of a strictly defensive weapon. It is a gun to get you out of a bad situation, to make escape possible, more or less. It's amazing what you can get away with there. And a lot of people know that I carry with me when I travel this little thing right here. I only have so many safe places where I am. I'm, of course, in a hotel room, and I'm at an end, and so I have a little bit more freedom on where I can point this thing, but there are certain directions I cannot point it just because of it's a hotel, and you know, I'm sure my neighbors through the wall would not appreciate me pointing, you know, a gun at them. But lots of people know that I travel with this thing. Now, in a lot of ways, I would prefer something that is more powerful. I really would. And I'm kind of trying to do that with the other gun that I was hoping to have a review out on. But at the same time, I don't feel undergunned with this thing. It's always nice to have something that's more powerful. It's nice to have something with more range. But if this is what you got, or something like this is what you got, whatever the equivalent for you would be, the M1 Carbine data from World War II would suggest that something like this will probably get you through. This thing is a 9mm. It's not overly powerful. It's not even as powerful as M1 Carbine rounds were, but with modern defensive rounds, perfectly adequate. And as you can see, this thing has a relatively large magazine in it. I've got more than enough rounds for the vast majority of things that would come up. So is it underpowered compared to other guns? Yes. Does it have as much range as other guns? No, it doesn't. But if it's going to be used in a typical defensive manner, it's probably more than enough. I don't have any qualms about people upgrading if they can, but if this is what you got, this is what you can afford, and guns like this are usually a little bit more affordable than their intermediate rifle or full-size rifle or shotgun equivalent components are. Well, shotguns can actually be relatively cheap. The bigger problem with them is that, like I said, operating them under stress can be a problem, and then they usually don't have a very high round capacity, etc., etc. There's some issues with shotguns. Not that they can't be used, but there are some issues that you need to be aware of, and for the average person, I generally wouldn't recommend them. But if that's what you grew up on and you're comfortable with, yeah, rock on. You know, it's your life, defend it as you so choose. But for me, given the size and weight constraints that I have in my suitcase, and given that the other gun that I was kind of hoping would replace this is not working so well, I'll take a relatively reliable, quote-unquote, underpowered gun if I have to. And the M1 Carbine data suggests that even a relatively unreliable underpowered gun is still going to be adequate as long as you can get out to 50 yards and still be sufficiently accurate, and it's something that has some kind of a third point of contact. In this case, it has a brace. A proper stock of course is going to be better, but you make do with what you have to do. The evidence that is out there suggests that it is perfectly adequate. And like I said, a lot of times these guns can be less costly than especially their rifle or intermediate or rifle caliber counterparts are. I'm thinking specifically of something like the Sub 2000. The Sub 2000 by Keltec has been a relatively inexpensive gun. This year and last year are not great things to go by in terms of that, but compared to, say, an AR-15 or, an AR-15 or an AK, or an AKM basically, some kind of AR or AK platform, it's relatively cheap. That particular gun will do things like taking Glock magazines, and so you can put quite a few rounds in there. You could go a lot worse. If that's what your budget is, rock on. You know, I think the data suggests that it's perfectly adequate. It's always nice to have more, you know, more power, more range, more round capacity, etc., etc. But if you find yourself in a situation where, hey, this is what I got for whatever reason it was given to me or whatever the case is, it's amazing what you can make do with. And if you're using it strictly defensively, you don't need as much as you might think you do. Just random musings and thoughts on the M1 Carbine and what it tells us about what we don't really need in the modern defensive usage. It never hurts to have more power, more range, that kind of thing, but you can get by with surprisingly little. You don't want a handgun unless, concealment is an issue. Something more than a handgun is good, and like I said, there can be size and weight constraints. If your suitcase or what you're traveling with is considerably smaller than what I travel with, something even like this CZ Scorpion might not fit in what you travel with. Some people carry some pretty small luggage when they travel. They're very light. I don't go quite that small. You might have size and weight constraints that necessitate a pistol, a handgun. Legally, that was actually a pistol. You might have reasons for the handgun, but if you can get something other than a handgun that's bigger, has a third point of contact, the M1 Carbine data would suggest that makes the gun considerably more effective, just that change alone. And it doesn't have to be overly powerful. It doesn't have to have overly great range. Defensively, you're not very likely to use it past 50 yards. You're just not. Like I said, it doesn't hurt to have more, but you can get away with surprisingly little if you have to. And another advantage that gun has is that it takes the same ammo as my actual concealed carry handgun. That never hurts. Being able to feed both guns out of the same box of ammo is really not bad, especially when you consider that these days all that you might be able to afford is just one box of ammo. And being able to feed two guns out of that same box has some real advantages right now. So anyways, random musings, random thoughts. I know it gets long and rambly, and that's me. Whew. Thank you guys for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.